Well, hello everybody, and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DaCosta, and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. Today I just wanted to talk a little bit about how the Bible makes absolutely no sense whatsoever, unless the mission, the gospel mission to seek the elect, was temporary. Okay, now this will be probably a short and quick one, but think about this now for a second. You know, people tend to argue against the limited time frame of the gospel mission. The futurist says that the gospel mission is ongoing today. God is seeking out his elect today, and that it just continues on for all eternity. The inconsistent full preterist would say that the gospel mission was fulfilled in one sense by the time of the coming of the Lord in AD 70. And yet somehow, after AD 70, that gospel mission still goes on. Although they would twist it a little bit and say that it's not the same sort of gospel mission. It doesn't have fiery judgment at the end of it, like the destruction of Jerusalem. But it is a gospel mission nonetheless. And it does involve preaching the good news of Jesus and people being saved from something. Even though the final judgment, the great throne judgment, the final destruction, the fiery torment, everything that was at hand is long in the past and never had anything to do with us, they would still say that people need to be saved from something else. They just don't know what. They can't tell you what. They come up with things like eternal death. But the Bible doesn't say anything about being saved from eternal death. It's just a kind of a man-made idea that tries to keep people in the game. Then you have the consistent preterists, the IOers, the Israel-only proponents, like myself, who say that the gospel was temporary. The mission went out from the time of Christ and would be completed and fulfilled by the time of his coming, which was within a generation of when he gave his Olivet Discourse, according to him. He also said in Matthew 24 that the gospel would go to all the nations and the whole world, and then that same end that he encapsulated in that generation, that end would come. So very easily we can see that Jesus did not have an eternal, ongoing, forever, never-ending mission in mind. Jesus had a very limited, quick, short work upon the earth, like Paul calls it in Romans 9, mission. That was what was in his mind. That was what he was talking about. And he made it very clear that this would all be completed by the time of his coming. Because naturally and logically, when he comes for his saints, as the apostles put it, that would be the time when this would all be fulfilled. You cannot say that the Lord is going to come for his saints, take his saints, and then after he does that, there will be more saints. That just doesn't make any sense. That's a desperation attempt. The logical thing, the clear thing to say would be that the coming of the Lord for his saints was the end. That was the completion. That was when all Israel was saved, like Paul said, which included the fullness of the ones in the nations. So yeah, it's very interesting how people can be so inconsistent and so illogical when it comes to this. The other aspect of this common sense type of argument is the fact that prior to Christ, there was no gospel mission. Let me repeat that. Prior to Jesus, however many hundreds, thousands, bazillion years that humanity existed prior to Jesus, and no one in their mind would dare argue that humanity didn't exist prior to Jesus, because we know humanity goes back much farther than the time that people speculate Jesus lived. So, humanity existed. And, according to the tale, all humanity is under this curse. So this cursed and wicked and vile humanity existed long before this Jesus character ever came on the scene. And there was no gospel mission. There was no Great Commission. There was no call to go out to these people and to evangelize and tell them about this Savior of the world. There was nothing. So logically, one would have to ask, why? Why did it happen when it happened? Why did suddenly all things change? Why was there suddenly an urgency placed on saving mankind by God? Why was that even a thing that was suddenly brought up to save mankind? Because prior to that, there was no savior for mankind. Mankind just existed, supposedly in their cursed state, lived, died, and that was it. No hope for them, no gospel, nothing. Then suddenly, around the year 30 AD, comes this dude named Jesus who says, I am God, believe in me and you'll be saved, right? Interesting. So everybody prior was just kind of cut out. They had no chance. No gospel commission, no instruction to preach, nothing. Then suddenly this commission comes on. But this mission, this great commission that Jesus sets before these chosen ones, is not very universal at all. In fact, it's to go out and seek his sheep. It's to go out and seek the elect from the four winds of the earth. In other words, from far and wide. It's not a mission that would just go out and anybody who hears it can respond. There are statements in the New Testament that make it seem that way. But if you keep things in context, you can understand how those statements fit within the contextual details. Okay? In other words, he came to his own. Here's an example. He came to his own received him not, but as many that did receive him, he gave the rights to become sons of God. So people would wrongly assume that means he came to his own, the Israelites. The Israelites didn't receive him. So as many of people outside of the Israelites that did receive him, to them he gave the right to become sons of God. No, that's not what that's saying. It's saying he came to his own. For the most part, his own didn't receive him. But the ones within his own that did receive him, he gave the rights to become sons of God. So in other words, it was a remnant. And that's what the whole New Testament's about. It's about a remnant, the elect, the chosen ones. Okay, so the point is that this was not a universal mission even from the get-go. Okay, this was a very exclusive mission. It was a targeted mission. The sheep were in the nations. They were everywhere, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the land. And they were sent out to gather in to fish them back. They were sent out on a ministry of reconciliation. There is nothing in this story, from the start of the cover, from the first page to the last page, that suggests that pagan nations and foreigners needed reconciliation to God. There's nothing. The story shows a story of Israelites being with their God, being cast aside by their God, being betrayed or betraying their God, not obeying their God, turning from their God, walking away from their God, violating the laws of their God, breaking the covenants of their God. And so therefore, logically, it only makes sense that they were the ones who would need reconciliation. They were the ones who needed reconciling back to God. Everybody else in the story, all outsiders to that narrative, are just exactly that. They're outsiders. They don't hold a place within the salvation reconciliation narrative. Because what in the world would they need to be saved from? Why would they need to be reconciled if they never knew God to begin with? They never had the law. He didn't give it to anyone else. Psalm 147, Romans 9, so on and so forth. So again, the point here is that logically it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever to say that the gospel mission began in the year 30 and continues for all eternity. It doesn't. First of all, you cut out everybody prior to the year 30. They had no hope, no gospel, no nothing. That's a double negative. They didn't have anything, I should say. Suddenly, AD 30 comes on the scene, and Jesus says that this gospel mission would go out to the nations, and would have to be completed before the time of the end. And we know that he tells them very, very clearly that they were in the last days, and the end was approaching near. It was at hand. The axe was laid at the root. All things were about to be fulfilled. So this mission was sort of tied into that. It was wrapping up. Come on across, little woodchuck. It was wrapping up, and that's that. So to say that this is an eternal mission that goes onward beyond the end is about as inconsistent as one could get, and it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense. Right? The only way that this story makes any sense is if this was a temporary, limited, short work upon the earth, like Paul called it in Romans 9, and that this was going out seeking chosen individual sheep back to the fold, back to their shepherd. We know the only ones who were ever called sheep in the whole story were the Israelites. We know the only ones who ever had shepherds, both good and bad, in the story were the Israelites. So to suggest anything outside of those parameters is nuts. Absolutely nuts. So that's where I'm going to leave it. Short and sweet. Hope you all enjoyed it, got something out of it. And we'll catch you on that flippity floppity. Remember, give it a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe to the channel. And we'll catch you again. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye. Hey, guys. One other thing I wanted to mention that I didn't elaborate too clearly on Romans 9, or I at least left it out. The portion where it says that he would make a short work upon the earth. Now, if you look at that portion from Paul in Romans 9, that statement that he's making, that quoting of Isaiah, is in response to his question to himself, or I guess his rhetorical question in verse 24. Well, we'll start in verse 23. He says, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy, which he had prepared beforehand for glory, even us whom he called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles? Then, after he asks this question, he quotes Hosea. He says, as he says also in Hosea, I will call them my people who were not my people, and her beloved who was not my beloved. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there you shall be called sons of the living God. So, if you look at that portion in Hosea, you can see that it's all about the lost Israelites, the dispersed, scattered, out in the nation Israelites, okay? But let's proceed to the next verse or two and see what this short work upon the earth is all about. So verse 27 now. Now remember, Paul just asked rhetorically about the Gentiles, right? Not the Jews. He assumes that they already understand. In verse 24, he said, even of us whom he called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles. Right? In other words, but also of people out in the nations. And look what he says in verse 27. Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel. That's interesting. It makes little to no sense for Paul to be speaking about Gentiles here, as he quotes a passage from Isaiah that speaks about Israel. Right? It just doesn't make any sense if this is the true pagan context that people take it as, these Gentiles. What makes more sense is that these are the lost, scattered, dispersed sheep, the Israelites. So he says in verse 27, Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel. He basically throws that up, hands it to you in a golden platter to say, hey, here's who I'm talking about when I'm talking about these elect, predestined, foreknown Gentiles. Okay, here they are. They're Israel. And then he quotes Isaiah. He says, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved. Oh my goodness gracious. Crystally clear, isn't it, folks? But also of the Gentiles, although the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved. So there's your answer. Who are the Gentiles? They're the children of Israel, who were as the sand of the sea, meaning they were so numerous. They were everywhere. They were a great multitude from all nations. But a remnant of them would be saved, right? And then look at verse 28. Here's the kicker. He says, for he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because the Lord will make a short work upon the earth. Okay, so there's the dagger, all right? Remember what the question was. But also of the Gentiles? So what is Paul's focus in this little portion here? It's on the salvation of the Gentiles. Okay, because remember, he's just got done saying that the remnant would be saved. He's answering the question that he asked rhetorically about God having mercy upon the Gentiles. And he's answering it like other New Testament writers answer things. And he's quoting Old Testament passages to give a look or to give insight into what's actually happening in those last days. And every passage that he quotes is all about Israel. It's all about scattered, lost Israel. So, what does he say in verse 28? He will finish the work and cut it short, because the Lord will make a short work upon the earth. So, folks, what is Paul saying? He's saying that the salvation of these so-called Gentiles, these predestined Gentiles, would be finished. And it would be short. It's a short work upon the earth. Now, based upon the preterists' understanding of time statements like soon, near, short, at hand, that should be pretty clear, right? Because they like to argue against the futurists that all these things actually have meaning. But if the gospel mission is still going on, if the Gentiles are still being saved today, which makes no sense because there's no such thing as a Jew today. You don't have a temple, you don't have anything that the Jews had. So how therefore could there be Gentiles, biblically speaking? Or how therefore could there be nations outside of the Jewish state? Just doesn't make any sense. Right? But if Gentiles are still being saved today, then how could that be a short work upon the earth? Furthermore, if this mission is ongoing, never ending, and like Don K. Preston says, the Christian age has no end. If you please. If Don K. Preston is right, that the Christian age has no end, then how could he finish the work and cut it short? Because the work was the salvation of the Gentiles. Not only the Jews, but also of the nations. So this was a short, temporary mission. Okay, and the irony here is that everybody says, oh, you're damned or you're going to be held accountable to God because you don't believe him, blah, 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 blah. I do believe this. I do believe what the story says, right? And I'm not saying I believe it actually happened. But I'm looking at the story for what it says, and I'm believing it for what it says. And what it says is that these Gentiles, whom Paul was speaking of, were the lost tribes of Israel. They were the Israelites. And what it says is that this mission was not eternal. It was not forever. It was a short work upon the earth. And what it says is that when the fullness of these Gentiles came in, the result of that would be all Israel saved. In Romans 11. And we can see back to Romans 9 in verse 29, Paul closes that little section out and he says, and as Isaiah said before, he quotes Isaiah again, he says, unless the Lord of Sabbath had left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom and been made like Gomorrah. So what's he saying? He's saying, well, God had left a seed of Israelites out in the nations. Otherwise, they would have become like Sodom. They would have been gone. Okay. Then he goes on, he says in verse 30, what shall we say then, that Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness of faith? But Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, has not attained to the law of righteousness? Well, what's he saying there? He's using the word Israel to speak of the Jews, obviously, because he says, but Israel pursuing the law of righteousness? Who pursued the law of righteousness? It was the Jews. So you have to be careful because these terms are synonymous, and very often they're used to speak of different groups. You could be using Israel on one hand, Paul could, to speak of just the Jews. On the other hand, you could be using Israel, or Paul could be using Israel rather, to speak of collectively Jew and Gentile together, such as when the fullness of the Gentiles come in, all Israel will be saved. Okay, but here he says, but Israel pursuing the law of righteousness, right? So we have to be careful because Israel was also the place. It was the place where the temple was. It was the place where the Jews were. And Paul uses that term differently at times. But overall, it's very clear what Paul does here. He asks a rhetorical question about the Gentiles. He answers it by quoting 3 passages all about lost, scattered Israelites. And he says this would be a short work upon the earth. Okay, so it's finished. And that matches what Jesus said, doesn't it? Matthew 24:13, I believe it is. This gospel of the kingdom will go to all nations, and then the end will come. Short work, folks. Short work upon the earth. All right, folks, I'm going to add this to the end of that one. I'm going to append it to that one. And I hope you all liked it. I hope you give it a like-a-rooski. And I hope you all subscribe-a-rooski if you haven't yet. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.